Hello and welcome to Sustainable Finance Week. We'll be bringing together global policymakers, opinion formers and professionals from across private wealth and sustainable finance to discuss private capital, financing sustainability.
Congratulations for developing what is now a world-class international event.
Business has to change, society has to change. We have to be much more intentional and quicker at addressing environmental and social challenges.
I think that is one of the real success stories of Guernsey, is that we are already doing that. There's always going to be sort of little things that are different here and there. In fact, there's a lot of like-minded people here who have a common goal.
At the cutting edge of impacting the climate in the most positive way.
The challenges the insurance industry are facing.
You think about the amounts of data that an insurer has.
What we know about future climate change and how that relates to the insurance industry.
What net zero actually means and what it looks like in investment portfolios.
You are, by accident of fate, alive in an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet. And I think it's so true. I would argue there really isn't any other agenda than this.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Rupert Pleasant, and I'm the CEO of Guernsey Finance. Guernsey Finance itself is a joint initiative between industry and the states of Guernsey to connect and promote Guernsey as an international finance centre into its target markets. It gives me great pleasure to open the third and final core day of Guernsey Sustainable Finance Week 2022 in association with our media partner, the Financial Times. Welcome back to those of you who've been with us all week, and obviously a great welcome to those who are joining for the first day. We've still a number of exciting fringe events tomorrow, but today brings to end the more formal proceedings. Today we'll be engaging as we did on the previous 2 days. I'm absolutely confident in saying that this has been the most accessible Sustainable Finance Week to date, now in its third year. Before I go on, I'd like you to turn your attention to the screen for a very special video to drive home the message of why we're here today. For those of you who may have seen this footage before, please do excuse us. We think it's essential for the new attendees to hear from Rachel and experience the most important messaging. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Rachel Scott and I'm a producer and director at the BBC's Natural History Unit in Bristol. I work alongside Sir David Attenborough on series such as Blue Planet 2 and Frozen Planet 2, which is on air at the moment. I'm also very proud to say that I'm a Guernsey girl, and so I'd like to welcome you all to our beautiful island as part of Guernsey's Sustainable Finance Week 2022, and I'm just sorry that I can't be there in person to meet you all. For the series, I was able to travel all over the world to help film, and I think the thing that I found most amazing and surprising about working on this series was the variety and diversity of life found in the frozen parts of our planet. Not just in the Arctic and the Antarctic, but in frozen peaks, under the ice in frozen lakes, frozen tundra, deserts and grasslands, and the taiga forest. It's been a really amazing series to have been a part of, and the reason that we felt that it was time to make the follow-up to the original more than 10 years ago is because technology has improved so much in that time. We're able to tell stories that we simply wouldn't have been able to tell just a decade ago. But also, these cold parts of our world are changing rapidly because of climate change, and so we wanted to document that change. We, of course, film predominantly natural history, but we also wanted to film the change that was occurring on our watch. And so we filmed the melt from microscope level right up to commandeering satellites to take daily photographs of the Arctic sea ice retreating and the ice on top of the Alps reducing. In the last 40 years alone, half of the Arctic summer sea ice has disappeared, and it's predicted that by 2035 it will disappear completely. Just around the corner from us in the Alps, they think that the Alps will be ice-free by the turn of the century. Of course, this has a fundamental impact on the life of the animals that live there, but it will also have a huge impact on us. We're all responsible for that, and we can all make a difference, but you in that room today can make a much bigger difference than most. You're world leaders and sustainable advocates, and the conversations and discussions that you might be having this week could really change the planet. So thank you for being here, and I'd like to share with you a short clip from my episode, Frozen Ocean.
Well, I think that's an incredibly powerful way to start the day when you see first-hand footage of the real damaging effects of climate change. Our thanks go to Rachel for her message and for the use of that clip. As she said, all of us in the room can make a huge difference as sustainable advocates and thought leaders. And the conversations we have this week can truly change the planet. A bit of background on Guernsey's involvement in sustainable finance. For those of you joining us for the first time today, Guernsey is a world leader and a force for global good through its strategic commitment to sustainable finance. The island's dedicated Green and Sustainable Finance Initiative, Guernsey Green Finance, has been a member of the United Nations Financial Centres for Sustainability since 2018, while the Guernsey Financial Services Commission is a member of the Network for Greening the Financial System. Guernsey has led the way with the launch in 2018 of the world's first regulated green fund regime, the Guernsey Green Fund, to provide the certainty of a trusted and transparent product to inspire investor confidence. Having introduced green private equity principles in 2020 and having launched an ESG insurance kite mark in 2021, we were absolutely delighted that the GFSC chose Sustainable Finance Week 2022 to launch Guernsey's Natural Capital Fund on Tuesday, proving that the island has been at the forefront of solving the climate crisis for a good number of years. In addition, our new report that was launched at the start of this event, Private Finance and its Role in Supporting the Transition to Net Zero, which we discussed yesterday, also identifies the vital role that the financial services industry can play in achieving a just transition to a future net zero. You'll find a few hard copies dotted around the venue, but we'll provide details of how to read this in digital a little later. So far this week, we have covered biodiversity and the energy transition. Today, our focus turns to carbon markets and pricing, which will round off the three key themes of Guernsey Green Finance's 2022 strategy. Over the course of the day, we'll explore the evolution of carbon markets and pricing their role in influencing the flow of capital innovation, how the investment fund industry is responding to and driving the net zero agenda, and the role of carbon pricing and markets in enhancing investment opportunities. We have a packed schedule of speeches and panel discussions led by expert thinkers and innovators in the world of sustainable finance. Obviously, we're holding this event in the shadow of extremely sad news for the United Kingdom and the rest of the world, following the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II on the 8th of September. Part of her vast legacy will be her love for the environment and preserving it for future generations. She herself gave a speech at COP26 last year, and her son, our new king, His Majesty Charles III, sent his best wishes to Guernsey for a successful Sustainable Finance Week last year. And His Majesty's Sustainable Markets Initiative video was played to open the event. We are truly proud to be playing our part in an issue that meant so much to Her Majesty and to her family. We'll be covering the event live on our social media channels via our dedicated Sustainable Finance Twitter page at Guernsey Green Finance. Feel free to engage with us there using the hashtag #WeAreSustainable to join the conversation. There'll also be an opportunity to network over drinks afterwards and discuss the key takeaways of the day, with a little something extra thanks to our keynote speaker today. Today's headline sponsor is RBS International, and we're delighted to have a carbon offset sponsorship package for the first time, supported by the International Stock Exchange based here in Guernsey. Sustainability is built into all aspects of the conference, but this sponsorship enables us to ensure the event will be truly carbon neutral. For its international beneficiary, TIES has selected a high-quality, internationally verified offset. The project is the Baum Invest Mixed Reforestation in Costa Rica, which aims to reforest pasture land previously used for extensive cattle ranching in northern Costa Rica, using mixed strands of various indigenous tree species as well as teak. Locally, TIES will donate to the Guernsey Conservation Volunteers, who work to conserve Guernsey's natural environment, working on picturesque sites and nature reserves around the island to maintain and enhance the biodiversity of the area. So, let's get kicked off. My colleague Stephanie Glover, Guernsey Finance's Head of Strategy and Sustainable Finance, will be linking the sessions throughout the afternoon. But first, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to this afternoon's keynote speaker, NatWest Group Head of Climate Change, James Close. James has spent his career working between the public and private sectors with a focus on mobilising finance. He is now committed to working on some of the most challenging global issues, focusing on sustainable development and climate change. James was the leading voice for sustainable finance at COP26, with NatWest being the principal sponsor of the conference. He's also a member of the Energy and Natural Resources Advisory Group for the ICAEW and was a Director for Climate Change at the World Bank in Washington, D.C. It's a great honour for James to be with us in Guernsey, so please can you join me in welcoming James to the stage. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. It is truly wonderful to be here with you all today. And I feel a bit anxious about following both the opening remarks, but of course that wonderful video that Rachel sent us. And I think as I was reflecting this morning, just walking around this really beautiful island, we do so in the face of an energy crisis and the threat of war in Europe, but also horrendous floods in Pakistan. So we need really, I think, to lift our spirits a little bit with some talk about the solutions that we can put in place to enable us to address the climate crisis. And I want, over the course of the next 10 or 15 minutes or so, to give you a sense of where the carbon markets have evolved from and what their importance is and relevance is to all that we do and think about sustainable finance, and then focus a bit on the opportunity that this presents to us and some of the enabling actions that will help us get there. I couldn't help but start look at Guernsey and carbon together, and I was looking at all the excellent work that you've done in terms of committing to net zero and enshrining that in law, and also the participation you have in so many of these wonderful fora. But two things did catch my eye as I flicked through the Google screen. One was something from ITV that I think came out a couple of years ago that said that islanders are being encouraged to offset their carbon footprints. And the other was from the Guernsey Press, which was investments needed to hit net zero. And I thought that was really quite a good way of encapsulating what carbon markets are for. They're there to connect demand for emissions reduction with the supply of projects that are going to enable us to do that as cost effectively as we possibly can. So probably if there's one thing to take away from all of this, that's the role that carbon markets can play. And I'm going to link that, I think, at the very end to our collective call for action here in terms of what we can do. But as I start here thinking about the evolution of carbon markets, and of course they've been around for really quite a long time. We were chatting about carbon markets in 2008 and a lot of the work that had come out of the Kyoto Protocol and the carbon CDM, the Carbon Development Mechanism. And of course that's emerged into what we have now, which is this voluntary carbon market, which is still relatively small, but huge aspirations to scale up very rapidly. And I think there's an expectation that that is going to go from where it was in 2019 to increase by somewhere in the region of between 15 and 20 times by the time it gets to 2030. And Mark Carney and Bill Winters and others have been really promoting that scaling up of the voluntary carbon markets as an important contribution to climate action. But the evolution of this market has had to deal with some pretty challenging backgrounds. I mean, I think the first thing that people would note about the carbon markets is that there's a lack of rigorous standards that have consistently been applied. And I think that has given suspicion to many who are involved in the climate activism and also opened them somewhat to abuse by market participants. And I think what we're starting to see now is that lack of robust regulation, which, when you compare it to other established markets is quite evident, is now being addressed as we start to build integrity into the implementation of these carbon markets and also underpinning them with high integrity carbon credits that can deliver really meaningful ways of helping us get onto the journey to net zero. And I think it's worth us just reflecting on what carbon credits are. So carbon credit really is a project that involves really two forms of approach. One is the removal of carbon, which is through nature or technology. And of course, a lot of the nature ones have got very positive biodiversity benefits as well. But a lot of these are involved around rewilding and tree planting, which sequesters carbon. And these are quite well established and have been going on for a long time and exist locally and also internationally, many, of course, in emerging and developing economies. The other one is the avoidance or reduction credits, and some of these are the ones that I think found themselves in quite difficult water because you're trying to demonstrate that these projects are better than the alternative, and quite often they're substituting fossil fuel-based production for renewables. And sometimes, if you go down to the micro level in developing the emerging markets, helping people move away from cook stoves, which can have quite high polluting aspects, but also be quite poor for people's health. All of those have some great attributes associated with them. But the ones that I think have most integrity are the removal credits. And that's partly because we recognize that through the construction of the Paris Agreement, we need to get to this point of net zero by 2050. And the Paris Agreement has structured it so that every country makes their commitments through their nationally determined contributions. And that then enables all of these credits to come together in a way that gets us from where we are today to where we need to be in the future. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as I talk about the importance of the markets and their implementation. Some of this is embedded in Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So Article 6 specifically allows countries to voluntarily cooperate with each other to achieve the emissions reductions that they've set out in their nationally determined contributions. And these are called the international compliance markets. Again, they're starting to emerge and develop, but the voluntary carbon markets sit alongside that. And there's an important connection, I think, between the compliance markets, the Paris Agreement, and the voluntary markets, in as much as we have to look at this as the whole system of reducing carbon. And that's where the voluntary markets need to be linked to the ambition that individual countries have of reducing their emissions. And part of the way of doing that is this concept of a letter of agreement that shows that a project developed in a country is actually genuinely additional to the ambition that that country has through its nationally determined contributions. So all of this, I think, is demonstrating what the potential of carbon markets and carbon credits has. But the application, I think, for this audience and for us as we think about mobilizing sustainable finance is that we recognize that, and Larry Fink puts this, I think, very nicely, that every company in every industry will be transformed by the transition to net zero. And if you think about where we need to get to by 2050 and what the world will look like in net zero, in a net zero world, we recognize that every single aspect of what we do will change. And we as financiers and the providers of finance need to be aware of that as we work out how our finance is going to flow to support that transition. And that's why we at NatWest put climate change at the heart of our purpose-led strategy, and why we've been so active about mobilizing the finance for the transition. So for what I think this means for businesses and funds is that we need to make our commitments towards net zero, and we need to think about what we're going to do to deliver those, and then we need to work out what role carbon credits are going to play in that transition. And of course, some of these are called offsets because they enable us to offset some of the emissions that we've got. But if you go to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero guidance and the Science-Based Targets Initiative guidance, they would emphasize that we all have to do our decarbonisation, and then we start to think about how we deal with residual emissions, those minimal emissions that exist that we can't get rid of through any other way than buying these carbon credits or carbon offsets. Now, what they encourage is that we have that net zero as an endpoint, and that we actually buy credits along the way as well, partly because that enables us to build this market at pace and at scale, and also starts to prove what some of the pricing points are for the trajectory towards net zero. And we're guided a little bit by, around this by the work that Nick Stern and Joe Stiglitz did on the Commission for Carbon Pricing that came out of the Paris Agreement. And they focus on a social cost of carbon of, by 2030 of $80 to $100 a tonne, and $40 to $60 a tonne by 2020. This work was done 5 or 6 years ago. So that gives us the benchmark price of the social cost of carbon, which is the impact that carbon has on our economy in terms of the way in which it's produced. But at the same time, these market mechanisms are settled by buyers and sellers, and currently they're settling at a range of prices between $3 a tonne in the voluntary carbon markets to up to $30 a tonne for ones that have other benefits around social impact and nature and biodiversity at around $30 a tonne. So we need to bridge the gap between the social cost of carbon and the market price of carbon in a way that enables us to demonstrate that we've mobilized the finance that's required to get us to net zero. I think it's really important that we anchor what we're doing in integrity and the integrity of these carbon markets. And as a result of the work that Mark Carney and Bill Winters and others did on scaling up of the carbon markets, we now have a lot of work going on into assessing the integrity. Now, there's existing mechanisms for integrity, such as VCS and VERA, which look at the integrity and measure the amount of carbon reduced or as a function of those carbon credits. But we still have a lot of work to do to really think hard about the best way to trade carbon, to increase its liquidity, to expand the market size, and to address some of the challenges of non-standard transaction processes. That should enable us to get to a point of price discovery that means that we can be confident that the carbon markets that we have of the future are going to get us onto that net zero journey as cost effectively and as efficiently as we possibly can. And I think at the heart of this is transparency. For all of us who work in finance, we know that what we report is what gets evaluated. We know how important it is for our stakeholders, and somewhere in the line, somewhere is providing that finance. And for us as a bank, it's important that our climate-related disclosures report demonstrate what we're doing and that how we're delivering against the targets and ambitions that we've set for ourselves. And I think the same is true in the carbon markets. And we're really excited about the way in which these markets are likely to emerge over a period of time. So we've developed a market called Carbon Place, which is a strong global ecosystem for the voluntary carbon markets. And it enables the banks who are involved in this, 8 banks who have committed to it, to leverage the banking relationship so we can make that connection between those who want to buy carbon credits and those who want to supply them. And we think the interesting and exciting part of this is the way in which the credits get tokenized on the platform. So that enables us to make that connection between buyers and sellers without having to go through all of the anti-money laundering and know your customer pieces that would happen if the buyers and sellers were connecting directly. So we think there's a huge amount of value to be had through the way in which that market's constructed. Now, of course, there are other markets that are developing, and I'm sure you'll hear about some of those today. And I think they can be very complementary in terms of the way in which we bring integrity to this carbon market and use it as a means of mobilizing the finance, particularly for emerging countries and developing economies, because they're the ones who've done least to contribute to the climate crisis and need the most finance to enable them to protect their forests or build their nature and biodiversity. I commend you for the great project in Costa Rica that's being used for an offset, which will have no doubt carbon benefits, but also huge social benefits at all. So, that's, I think, where we've come from as the evolution of those carbon markets, the connection to the system and the Paris Agreement, the role that voluntary carbon markets play alongside the compliance markets, the fact that this is a great mechanism for mobilizing finance, for helping us be really thoughtful about the way in which we reduce our emissions, and particularly those residual emissions, as quickly and as cost effectively as we can. And then open up the opportunity for ways of trading and aligning the interests of many of the actors in the system to get into play these really high-quality carbon credits that have great integrity. So I think I just want to end really with a call to action, which is that all of us sitting in this room can start to think about how we use carbon markets and how we engage in them in a way that has integrity and quality associated with it. And I think my plea to everybody would be to commit to transparency in terms of what you're trying to achieve and publishing the kind of projects that you're buying and the price at which you're buying that, so we can get more and more price disclosure. And I think that's also what's going to enable many of the people in here from the businesses, but also the funds, to enable the net zero ambition that we're all talking about here to be delivered as cost effectively and as quickly as it possibly can. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm sure you'll hear much more about a range of diverse opinions about what we can do and how we can go about it. But we as an organisation are really committed to this agenda. We are one of the few that has done entirely removal credits in our purchase of carbon credits. And we look forward to working with all of you to try and connect and mobilise this market as quickly and as efficiently as we possibly can. So thank you very much, and really look forward to the conversation that we're about to have.
Thank you so much, James. And I guess for transparency, that carbon offset is $45 a tonne. So we're quite pleased with that high cost there. So thank you very much for getting us underway today and helping to set the scene for discussions on the impact of carbon and the challenges in decarbonisation, but also the opportunities arising from markets and platforms like Carbonplace and the VCM. For those of you joining us for the first time today, my name is Stephanie Glover, and I'm Guernsey Finance's Head of Strategy and Sustainable Finance. Thank you for joining us for our third and final day of Sustainable Finance Week. Today, we'll be exploring carbon markets, pricing, and offsets, a topic that will have an effect on everyone in the room as your businesses start to integrate the cost of your emissions into your business models. Joining James on stage to discuss the case for voluntary carbon markets, I'm delighted to welcome Richard Kelly, Foresight Sustainable Forestry Company co-founder. This is the London Stock Exchange's first listed natural capital investment vehicle. Richard is an expert on natural capital and forestry. He has overseen around £250 million of investment into the sector across more than 40 transactions. Speaking of the London Stock Exchange, we have Amy Smith, Sustainable Finance Manager at the LSE. Amy is part of the Capital Markets Sustainable Finance team, where she is a key member of the London Stock Exchange's Voluntary Carbon Markets team. Amy contributes to the development of a public market solution to the scaling of the voluntary markets. Finally, I'd like to invite Director of Ethics and Sustainability at John Lewis, Maria Rampani. Maria drives the environmental and social agenda across finance, consumer goods, and retail sectors. She is delivering change for John Lewis and is critical to taking the partnership from ambitious goals to action. As moderator, we have my colleague Josephine Bush, who is our Sustainable Finance Strategic Advisor. Take it away, Josephine.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you, James, for that really informative address. It was really great. We're going to focus on the voluntary carbon market in the main, but I wanted to kick off with the very beginning of the supply chain, Richard, if I can throw my first question to you. Can you talk us through how a carbon credit is created?
Yeah, absolutely. So one carbon credit effectively represents the option to offset carbon that is emitted somewhere else, either as a company or an individual. And one credit is equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide that's been either avoided or sequestered from the atmosphere. So examples of carbon capture type projects are things like afforestation, so where we're planting trees. As those trees grow, they directly sequester carbon from the atmosphere. Whereas an avoidance type credit, it works slightly differently. It's about avoiding, so deforestation, for example, and so putting in measures to prevent deforestation that if they weren't put in place, that carbon would otherwise be expected to end up in the atmosphere. And you can receive credits for both of those things. And there are different types of projects. You've got nature-based solutions such as afforestation or peatland restoration, but there's also technology that can be used. You can capture carbon from industrial and chemical processes. And there's also direct air capture technologies which are being developed. So when you're developing a project, the first thing to understand is what is the baseline. So what is if we do nothing, what is the carbon profile? And it's essential to get that part right. And you do that over what is considered a sort of a permanent period of time, but for the purposes of creating a carbon credit, it's generally considered over a 100-year time frame. You then look at the project and what is the amount of carbon that is either directly sequestered or is avoided from being emitted into the atmosphere over that same 100-year time frame. And the difference between those two is the number of carbon credits, or the amount of tons of carbon is the benefit of the project. You need to do that assessment before you do the project, before you sort of plant trees, or as a key demonstrator that it is an additional project, that you can't do it retrospectively. You used to be able to do it retrospectively, but the best practice rules now mean that you have to do this assessment up front and before the project is initiated.
And how difficult is the methodology for doing that assessment?
So there are various methodologies available. So there are verifiers, bodies that set these methodologies. So for example, for afforestation in the UK, there's a quasi-government body called the Woodland Carbon Code. And they have published a whole series of rules, and they have an online Excel-based calculator which you can download, and you sort of input the fundamentals of the project into that, and using their rule set, it will spit out, this is how much carbon we believe this project will create.
Is that the only methodology? Or
no, there are various methodologies. There are other bodies, Verra, Gold Standard. There are a number of different verifiers. They all use slightly differing methodologies. And there are also international standards, best practice standards, such as ACROA, which some of these methodologies adhere to and others don't. But for the most high integrity methodologies, they will adhere to these best practice standards.
Technology can really help us here, because satellite imagery, Earth observation systems, somebody once told me that we know where every tree in the world is. So you can see whether or not they're being deforested and the rate of that's happening. So harnessing technology and building it into that certification scheme can be really quite powerful.
And I can see that that's a huge area for innovation within itself and an investment opportunity as these methodologies develop. But I suppose, Richard, if you think about the Woodland Carbon Code, which is very UK-based, how translatable that is that then across borders in terms of acceptability of that assessment methodology?
Yeah, so I think there are some fundamental principles that are translatable, across all bound internationally. The two key ones are permanence. So whatever the project is, whether it's sequestering carbon or avoiding carbon being emitted, that whatever the project is, it must be a permanent solution. And if it's not permanent, then you shouldn't be receiving, carbon credit recognition for that project. So that's one fundamental principle. And the other is this principle of additionality. And additionality means that the project without the economic benefit of the carbon credits would not be economically viable. And so by having the financial benefit of the sale of carbon credits, that makes the whole project viable. And it's this principle that, and there are financial additionality tests, and the Wood and Carbon Code, as an example, has one, and so do the other standards, that projects need to pass to demonstrate that they are financially additional as a result of the carbon credit. And if it can't pass that test, then it shouldn't and won't be receiving credit.
So to your point then, James, in your address, you talked about removal. If you have a wind farm that is obviously replacing fossil fuel production, you have lower emissions, you've got a different grade of
exactly, and you want to know what, and I think all of these have to have integrity, and that's what VCS and the certification schemes do. But I think if you're using removal credits, then you can be more confident that that's actually absorbing carbon that goes beyond the baseline that's already established in the economy. So the problem is if you've rapidly getting out of coal and you're putting in renewables, how much more of that is a function of the carbon project that you've got? And that's why I think we really like the idea of using removals. So it's not that the others aren't useful as well, it's just they have a different
quality
to, yeah, exactly, and therefore quite often at a different price, as Steph was saying.
And renewable energy used to qualify more freely for the creation of voluntary carbon credits, but now it's seen that it's seen as additional without, or it's not additional because renewables can happen, certainly in developed markets, without the need for the additional finance that comes from voluntary carbon credits. So renewable energy doesn't really qualify except for in some emerging countries.
So if I go through the process then, as you've just explained, of assessing, going through the methodology for assessing a unit of credit, how do I get to the point of certification and having actually a tradable instrument?
Yes, so you agree with the verifier how many credits you're expected to get. You then initiate the project. So you establish the forest and the development process, or you install the technology, whatever the project might be. You complete that project. And then a key step that the vast majority of verifiers have is then a sort of a physical inspection of the project. They come out and inspect, in our case, our newly planted forest or the direct air capture machine, whatever it might be, and they verify that what was in the original application aligns with what has actually happened. And if there's been any changes, then they make an adjustment to that. And at that point in time, assuming the forest has been planted or the machinery has been installed, they will issue the project developer with what are called pending issuance units. And they're effectively they're a carbon credit, but they're effectively a forward. They recognize all future carbon sequestration or avoidance that is expected to be delivered over the next 100-year time frame. And as part of that, they define, there are packages of vintages of credits that are expected to convert from being a forward to being actual carbon that has been sequestered, and those are called verified carbon units. And there's a profile of conversion between forwards to verified carbon units. And most bodies require a physical inspection periodically. So in the case of forestry, it's a physical inspection of the forest every 5 and 10 years throughout the 100-year lifetime of that forest to check that the trees are growing at the rate you were expecting to, and the verifier signs off on that conversion rate, such that it's only these verified carbon units that can then be used for carbon offsetting. But you can trade, so both the pending issuance units, so the forward, and the verified carbon unit are tradable. You can sell those either separately, retaining the asset, or you can sell them stapled to the asset. But the key thing is you can only use the verified carbon unit for carbon offsetting. And once you retire that unit on the centralised registry, that's it. It's a one-way ticket. It can only be used once. And a centralised registry recording that is a fundamental component to ensure, the integrity of credit, so there's not double counting going on.
And then the value proposition then is quite interesting to think about at this point in time, isn't it? With the carbon price quite volatile, but the long-term trajectory upwards. Can you say something then about the value proposition?
I think the value proposition for anyone who is purchasing and then retiring voluntary carbon credits is it counts towards, you can directly use that to count towards your net zero target or your SBTI target. So the value proposition is that you're making a direct contribution to the fight against climate change. And in addition to just, if you retire, 100,000 carbon credits, yes, the finance from that enabled the planting of those trees or the capture of that carbon from the atmosphere. But potentially you're able to make a sort of, there is also a tradability perspective of it. We are increasingly seeing speculators who are buying credits not for retirement, but as an investment, as an asset class in its own right. And we've recently seen, hedge funds and new sort of carbon credit focused funds launch. So there are, it's for the ultimate customer is for a corporate or an individual to achieve net zero and make a contribution. But you can own and enjoy potential returns just by owning that carbon credit without having to retire it.
And just before we come on to the demand side, you've mentioned some of the key features of carbon credits, additionality, verification process. Could you just say something about some of the other features that we would expect to see as part of acceptable eligibility criteria?
Yeah, I mean, I think a centralised registry is, as I say, is essential to ensure there's a clear chain of custody that's going, between the project owner and it could be multiple owners of carbon credits, of that carbon credit over its life before the point of retirement. A clear chain of custody from cradle to grave of the creation of the credit to it ultimately being retired is essential.
Great. And now I'd like to come on to the demand side, Maria. Can you talk us through the John Lewis approach to carbon offsetting against the backdrop of your general approach to sustainability?
Sure, I can just make a little correction. It's John Lewis Partnership. So we have two brands, John Lewis and Rachel. So our climate change strategy is obviously applicable across the partnership for two brands. And the strategy, I'm going to go straight to the point, does not involve offsetting. So we have a number of commitments and a number of KPIs and targets that we are measuring, including net zero operations by 2035, which is scope 1 and 2, 100% renewable energy consumption. We want to phase out the use of fossil fuels in our fleet. And most importantly, well, equally important actually, we have a target to reduce energy consumption. So we have a decarbonization pathway. We are just going through the process with Science Based Targets initiative. And our strategy is simply, actually, we say it pretty transparently out loud and clear, we are not doing offsetting.
And why is that?
Because I think there is a fine line between offsetting, and I worked for a business good 10 years ago when we were buying gold standard offsetting credits. I think there is a fine line between kind of really trying to mitigate and reduce your carbon emissions and actually buying yourself out of it. And there are a number of, and sometimes it's actually compared to greenwashing. And that's one thing that we want to avoid, because as soon as you go into, well, we are offsetting, but how much are you actually reducing? And then you can see that actually you're increasing your carbon emissions, really absolute carbon emissions, but actually you're reducing them through offsetting. It's not really a valid way to tackle the issues of climate change. I think we need to reduce, we need to mitigate, we need to invest in new technologies and innovation. And then, obviously, if there is a residue, then we can offset. Another issue, it's expensive, right? I work for a retailer, we know cost of living crisis, we're all struggling. Just to give you an idea, we just calculated our Scope 3 emissions. If we were to offset our Scope 3 emissions, it would cost us 100 million annually. So is that the way to do it? I mean, plus science-based targets does not allow for offsetting. Now I'm going into the, I don't mean to, I mean, it's obviously a very credible market and sector.
It does allow for some offsetting. I think you have to decarbonise. I think you do have to decarbonise by 90%. You are allowed to use carbon credits for the residual balance, and that was what voluntary carbon credits were always intended for. It's not feasible that we're going to hit net zero if everyone just buys credits for and carries on with their operations as they are. And I admire John Lewis for trying to go further than that. But there will always be a residual balance, certainly to the end of the century. It's really hard to get rid of and to avoid, and also to mitigate carbon that has already been emitted into the atmosphere.
Of course, and what I say to that, we'll cross the bridge when we come to it, in 2032, if we do have residual. But I think we need to remain focused on actually going through our decarbonisation pathway and reaching our carbon reduction emissions without offsetting. If we see that we are missing all of our targets, then we will think about and we will actually definitely start considering. What I like the idea of is carbon removal credits, and actually the Scope 3 science-based targets allow for offsetting through carbon removal credits as long as it's within your value chain. So, and that can be done through afforestation, reforestation, or soil sequestration. But what that, just to give you an example, what that means, let's say we have a pig supplier, and they could, so that the pig farmer can actually sell their soil sequestration credits, but they would sell it to us, so it remains in your value chain. So it doesn't come from anywhere. So that means that, but I think it's still early stage, and you probably know better. I think it's, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done. But FLAG, which is forestry, land, and agriculture, Scope 3 emissions would actually allow that to happen. But I guess the framework around that needs to be developed. But to me, that sounds really attractive, because then we will work with our supply chain, with our suppliers, on them kind of getting additional revenue, and us using that to offset some of the Scope 3 emissions from land use.
So that's using your influence within the supply chain to help others sequester carbon. And would you embed that into your procurement processes?
Yes, of course. I mean, if when that program develops, and when it's mature enough, we will certainly be, looking to. I mean, we're already working with our farmers on regenerative agriculture practices. Planting tree. How do we maintain biodiversity at our suppliers' farms? But also looking further than that. I mean, I'm slightly focused on Waitrose at the moment. But if you look at John Lewis, the cotton production. And all of the the forestry as well, the wood that we use in our products. So, but it's just that in Waitrose our supply chain is a lot of it is British. So we are working our suppliers, and we have a commitment that all of our British farms will be net zero by 2035. And I think to achieve that, we might have to work on carbon removal credits.
But I mean, the thought experiment around this, I think, is, what's the most efficient way to get to net zero? And the economists would say, and Angel Guerra, the OECD head, said a big fat price on carbon, and that sort of forces you to think about these choices and trade-offs that you make. So, ultimately in your supply chain, you need some money to go to the farmer to do the zero carbon activity. It's almost like a quasi-carbon credit, because you've got a trade, you're paying more, and they're doing something, and as a result, you're building net zero into the whole piece. And I guess the argument that the economists would say is, well, why not be as explicit as you can about that in terms of the price in carbon, and use the voluntary carbon markets as a means of discovering it. And I think what's interesting about the way that the price gets projected is, you know, if Nick and Nick Stern and Joe Stiglitz are right that $100 a tonne by 2030 is the price, then we know how far we've got to go to the point where the offsets that we're buying are actually consistent with that net zero position over the long term. So, you know, we can talk about this in theory, but, you know, what I really like about what you've described, Maria, is how you deal with it in practice and what it means in terms of the ambition that you have as an organisation and how you're going about it today and what you might do at some point in the future. And I think that, you know, so the purpose of this conversation is almost to have one around what's the integrity of this voluntary carbon market and what's the integrity of all of us in terms of the way in which we deliver our net zero commitments.
No, it's a great point. And I mean, linking it back to the conversation we had with, or Adam Matthews' keynote address yesterday, where he was talking about transition strategies and supporting brown industries through the transition. There's an absolute recognition there that there will be a residual that cannot be abated, or we don't currently have the technology as yet to fully abate. So there is an implicit recognition within that there's a place for offsets, which also reflects the IPCC report. But I guess coming back to you, Maria, what's interesting is how it's driving your allocation of resource and views on capital expenditure as you look forward to how you deliver on your net zero strategy. Obviously, some organisations will embed the price of carbon into their internal thinking. That's not what you do. What are your thoughts about that? Shadow carbon pricing, embedding that into the decision-making process?
So yes, we don't actually do internal carbon pricing, and that is something that I am considering. But I think to me and for the John Lewis Partnership, I think what is most important is kind of change of culture and embedding that thinking into every single decision that we make. So in some cases, it's going to be fairly easy. Understanding how your business decision have an impact on our net zero pathway. So, for example, we have a farm. If we buy diesel tractors, it's pretty obvious that investment isn't helping us on our net zero path. However, there are other business decisions that we are making around maybe cost of goods or values or outsourcing that are not immediately obvious as to how it's impacting our net zero. So those are the things that we are trying to kind of develop some sort of, I don't like the word framework, but it is a framework, we were talking about it, but some sort of criteria to understand how our CapEx and RevEx expenditure is either contributing, either helping us on our net zero journey or not helping us on our net zero journey. So really lucky that the exec team of the partnership is very much engaged, especially our finance executive director. And we have recently linked our borrowing to KPIs. One of those is carbon emissions. So we are actually continually working to embed in all of our decision making, in all of our big investments, because if we don't understand how CapEx expenditure is aligned, then we can't really monitor. So I think it's embedding that culture into, right, I'm making a business decision, I'm investing X millions pounds into this project, let's evaluate what the impact is. And while we are focused on carbon, because carbon we can measure, it's a CO2 emission, right? There's also other issues such as biodiversity and nature loss that we are considering, such as land use and land degradation. So, deforestation. So how are we actually looking at this more holistically rather than just link it to carbon?
Yeah. You were sharing with us, actually just before this panel discussion, the new John Lewis
Waitrose.
The partnership.
Waitrose.
Waitrose advert, which was great. And I mean, obviously you're talking about the organisation's transition sort of strategy, but then your role in the marketplace to influence the consumer and their choice. And how they make carbon-informed choices is really interesting. I wonder if you could share with us the role and responsibility that you feel for that.
Sure. I believe that people care. People care where, you know, who made the product, whether that's food or whether that's furniture, how is it made, what resources are used. I think people are more and more interested, you know, if you think about animal welfare, where is our meat coming from? So when we in Waitrose talk about value and quality, you know, quality also means provenance of food. But I am also very much aware that our customers don't necessarily know about all of the stuff we are doing, and I have always been a Waitrose customer, but now even more so, I kind of understand the values that you know, value behind the value. So I think we need to help consumers make informed choices, because it's far too confusing. You know, this product is net zero, this is more sustainable, this is greener. I think the market, me as a consumer, I find it really confusing. And then there's a lot of talk about labeling. How do we label products to enable consumers to make choices that they want to make? And, you know, a ton of carbon or 100 kilograms of carbon, I mean, I don't think people understand what it means. I mean, I've been working in sustainability over 20 years, and I'm still kind of, what does it mean? Also, the question is, if you're buying a can of beans, you know, for 70p, 45p, are you really going to be looking at what is the carbon emission between, you know, two different products? So I think it's that labeling, whether it's linked to carbon or whether it's linked to something else, protection of nature, for example, or animal welfare or water use. So I think we need to look at different aspects. But I do understand that for all of these things, it's difficult. We don't have one single measurement. We don't have a measurement for nature, protection and restoration. We do have a measurement for carbon emissions. So that's why it's easier. It's just how do we translate that information to something that is easily understood by customers.
And I think it forces us to think differently as well. I mean, we're naturally oriented towards thinking in silos and delivery of specific measures. But the work that we've done on our climate transition plan, which started bottom-up, sector-based, has actually started us to think about, in aggregate, what are these systems? So what's the food and land use system? How does that connect with, you know, property and real estate? What's the connection with the energy system, and how does that link to mobility? And then you start to think about, well, you know, we need to decarbonize each of those systems, and we need to make them sustainable and nature positive and do all of those sorts of things. So how do we go top down and then back to bottom up in a way that enables us as financiers to finance this, but also individuals to kind of know what a sustainable lifestyle really is and how those things connect together? And I think that's when you start to get quite excited about, you know, how you bring, you know, $130 trillion worth of assets under management through GFANZ together to align with a net zero future in a way that's actually going to be systemic and change this whole system. Because you can't do this on a piecemeal basis. We all have to do it together.
Connected thinking.
Exactly.
Given the likely demands of all of those sectors for carbon, Richard, I wanted to bring us back to the supply side. So how do you think that we're going to meet the likely supply or demand or lack of demand for carbon offsets by 2030, 2050?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing to explain is the current, you know, what's the supply situation like today. So we've seen an exponential rise in terms of the number of net zero pledges. So SBTi pledges they've increased by 17-fold over the last 3 years. So it's gone from about 191 companies to over 3,000. There's another initiative called Net Zero Asset Managers, and over the course of the last year, we've gone from 30 trillion of net zero asset manager commitments to nearly 60 trillion in the space of a year. A very, very rapid expansion in pledges. What's interesting is we haven't seen a particular increase in the retirement of credits yet. Over the same period, over the last 3 years, retirements have roughly doubled, and actually over the last 5 quarters, they have declined slightly. So what we're seeing is this bow wave of potential future demand, but it's not yet translating into retirements. So today, there is about a 4-year stock of voluntary carbon credits that if there were no more credits ever created and demand carried on at current levels, it would take 4 years to run that supply down to zero. And my view is that is not very much stock of carbon credits at all. If you think about if pledges continue on that sort of exponential curve, that stock will be, when those companies and corporates start buying credits, 2030 perhaps. I think we'll suddenly see a real shortage in the supply of credits,
particularly given the energy crisis, right?
And particularly given the energy crisis. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that you can't just create these credits overnight. It takes a long time, in many cases, to create these projects. So, for example, afforestation projects, if you plant a new commercial forest, it takes about 35 years for all of the carbon credits from that project to completely convert from those pending issuance units into the verified units, which you can use for offsetting. And there's a profile, there's a conversion rate sort of every 5 years, but we can't just suddenly go out and plant all of these trees. It's going to take time. And I think there is going to be a real shortage in the supply of carbon credits. And my personal, in the year 2030 and in the years after, which we'll see a sort of a real spike in the voluntary carbon credit price. But I think that would be a good thing, because a higher carbon credit price enables more projects that would otherwise be unviable, and we need a higher carbon credit price in order for finance to drive into projects that are currently uneconomic, and that could be afforestation, but in particular technology, things like direct air capture, which is very, very expensive at the moment.
Can I ask a question? Can I ask
Great.
a question? So what do you need to happen? Because I know, for example, M&S was offsetting, but they don't do it anymore. I think Amazon is doing it, but they're obviously scrutinized. They don't have a very good reputation. So what do you think needs to happen? I mean, just on sustainability, not to the what do you think needs to happen for the offsetting market to really pick up? Is it maybe for SBTi to change their guidelines, so to include guidelines in offsetting in the guidelines, but obviously very strict rules and regulations? What can organization be, or what percentage can you offset? Because I think that would help.
I think that would be helpful. I also think educating the market more broadly about this chronic shortage in the supply of carbon credits. So, Waitrose and John Lewis's strategy of we're just going to wait to 2030 and then we might buy credits. Well, you might find that is very, very expensive in the year 2030. And I believe that companies should be considering carbon hedging strategies, securing their supply of carbon credits today for future use. Otherwise, you have this potential, unlimited future liability. And all of these companies who are making these pledges, I believe, will be scrabbling around in 2030, desperately trying to fulfill these pledges, and there literally won't be enough credits.
So you can actually buy credits.
You can buy the credit. You can buy a credit today, and if you can keep it for the next 100 years. Okay. It's only it's only when you retire it that you then can't use it.
Okay.
So my advice to corporates would be: look, don't wait to 2030. You should be securing your supply today.
Yeah, that's certainly what we're seeing. The companies that have 2030 targets for net zero in 2040 and have some idea of what their residual emissions look like are very nervous about the price of carbon and what the price of carbon is going to be in 2030. All we've seen is this upward trajectory in the price. And so economic sense is that you should be looking at purchasing carbon credits if you're going to at all, doing that as soon as possible and securing your future supply.
Yeah. Well, it would appear that the carbon price that you mentioned right at the beginning, James, the $100 a tonne, is woefully conservative.
Yeah. But I think what it reflects is the scale of the challenge that we face in order to get the money to flow to decarbonise our entire system. I mean, it's just mind-boggling. 52 gigatons of carbon that we currently produce, carbon dioxide equivalent, to get to 26 by 2030, which is halving over that period of time, which is what the science tells us we need to do. And we've identified maybe 10 through Glasgow. So we're just over a third of the way through that 26. And that's, we may have identified them, but we haven't implemented it. So you need, that's why I think, mobilizing this finance at scale, at the right price, is going to make a big difference. Whether you're investing early in carbon capture or direct air capture, or you're looking at reforesting, parts of the planet that have been heavily degraded, all of those sorts of things are going to contribute towards that journey towards net zero. And they're all, that's why it's going to be expensive, but it's also a great opportunity, because that's the way in which money flows differently from the way in which it flows today. And many of us, I think, feel quite frustrated about the way in which money is currently flowing. So this is the opportunity to rewire the entire financial system in a way that drives us towards sustainability and has greater equity and fairness associated with it.
But it's an opportunity, isn't it, that has risk for the developer, because if you're going to exploit that market opportunity, Richard, you're accepting risk with that, because the demand signals aren't completely and clearly there at the moment, nor is the price signal.
But the biggest risk is doing nothing. I mean, the biggest risk is continuing to emit 52 gigatons of carbon a year and seeing the Arctic disappear before our very eyes. I mean, that is the kind of battle that we're facing. And, and I think we have to recognise that we're not going to do this at the fringes and the margins. This has to be a mainstream activity of everything that we think about in terms of how we allocate finance.
So is NatWest buying credits?
We do buy credits, yeah, we do, but we started talking about carbon neutral, but we don't anymore. We buy those credits almost as a corporate social responsibility position.
But you don't use it in your reporting?
Well, we report them, but we don't net them off.
Okay.
But that's the transparency point. People can see what we do and where we're buying those credits and the quality of those underlying credits. And I think, to your point, we're looking at forward buying a lot of those credits, and that's why we're using Carbon Place to build our position on it and enable our customers and suppliers to trade by buying those credits. So we've got a great project, a mangrove project in Honduras that we're extremely excited about. But we have to invest a lot of money to get to the point where that mangrove project is actually producing the carbon that we're going to be able to use at that point where we can't go any further residually with our overall emissions.
So Amy, to pull you in, how do the public markets develop both integrity in the carbon market and help explore this economic opportunity?
Sure. So I guess if I just start by positioning where I fit in. So I work in the sustainable finance team in London Stock Exchange. And part of what we do is trying to ensure that we have a functioning market in a net zero future and build products and services that help our London-listed issuers to meet that low-carbon transition that has to happen. And in the context of the voluntary carbon markets, if we look at what a stock exchange is, inherently it exists to bring together those that have capital and those that need it in service of an objective. You start to see how the public markets can play a really big role in helping to direct finance into these carbon projects that we desperately need in order to increase the supply. We were part of the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, and they were very clear that more financing was needed for these carbon projects, things like afforestation, restoration of peatlands, carbon capture, things like that. The IPCC reports were implicit that we need to go much further than we already are if we have any chance of meeting net zero, that we need to also be looking at carbon removal. And then we've talked a lot about SBTI, and there was quite a significant development in the last week or so with SBTI, where they've been quite quiet around offsetting, and they've certainly said that it should only be used for your final 10%. But they've gone a step further, and they've said, yes, for companies, focus on your decarbonisation, that's incredibly important. But in parallel, you also need to be looking at carbon reduction and carbon removal that's beyond your value chain. And that's been quite a significant development in the voluntary carbon markets and what integrity looks like in the voluntary carbon markets. In terms of what the London Stock Exchange is looking to do is taking that existing VCM ecosystem, which has developed over a period of 15 years or so, that already has established qualifying bodies that we've spoken about, such as Verra, Gold Standard, established and huge project developers, and combining that with the public markets and the disclosure regulatory regime that exists in the public markets, in the hope that in doing so we can support that scaling. What that means practically is that we're creating a designation on our markets that helps investors to identify the funds and the companies that are directing investment into new carbon projects. There's a couple of things we hope to do when that launches. It launches in 2 weeks' time, the rules for that segment and designation launches. The first is that we want to improve market access for new investors, and we've spoken about the corporates that have net zero targets that will require carbon offsetting, so providing a new route for procurement of those carbon offsets, but also directing finance into those areas that have a huge opportunity for carbon projects like the Global South that just simply aren't getting the financing they need. And then just to quickly go back to that public markets framework, as part of that designation, we will be expecting that those funds and companies that are listed there have additional disclosure requirements. So they're providing a lot more information on the carbon credits and the carbon projects they're investing into. So things like the expected yield of the projects, the locations of the yield, the projects, the UN SDGs that they'll be contributing to. So really contributing to more and more information on carbon credits and increasing that transparency, which is something we desperately need in a market that's historically been an OTC market.
And do you think that this, amongst many other things, is going to provide a very positive signal for the carbon price?
So I think carbon credit pricing has been, up until now, a bit of a free-for-all, depending on who the project developers are, whether that's going through a broker, which bumps up the prices, and we really need additional price signals. And so to take an example of what we expect to happen on our markets, you will have funds that are listing, that are setting out in their investment policies what their carbon credit yields will be, and then they'll be listing at a specific share price. And there is, from that, there is an indication of what that price of that carbon looks like. I think we talk a lot about carbon credits as a commodity, but in many ways it isn't a commodity because one doesn't equal the other. They all represent a ton of carbon, but how you get to that and the additional co-benefits can be quite different. So I think we'll start to see that with the different investment strategies that exist, whether that's carbon removal, carbon reduction, that there will be different pricing of these shares and these funds.
And what's your view on that, Richard? Because you're part of the working group, aren't you?
Yeah, we've been working with the LSE since the beginning, certainly since our IPO last November. We're hugely excited about the VCM. We think it effectively connects corporates like Waitrose and John Lewis who have net zero or SBTI targets, and it enables those corporates to, instead of just purchasing carbon credits when the time comes, they can invest in a fund that qualifies for this and secure their supply of carbon credits whilst also enjoying a financial or potential financial return during the period. And part of the offering is that these companies, investment companies, will potentially offer investors in specie dividends of voluntary carbon credits in lieu of a cash dividend when the time comes. So it's hugely exciting, and you could see very substantial appetite from corporates who invest in these VCM qualifying investment companies. That will drive the share price of those investment companies up, you would expect, and that enables them to raise capital at a faster rate, which means more deployment in more planting of trees, more carbon avoidance projects. And we're really excited. We're working towards Foresight Sustainable Forestry being the first VCM designated investment company when the scheme launches in a couple of weeks.
And Richard, when you see the sort of uncertainty over the carbon price, as it is at the moment in the market, how easy is it to value natural capital premia and its stapling to land assets?
I think it's tricky. So there are two. There's the traditional way of looking at value. So if you take a piece of land, there's the sort of Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors Red Book methodology looks at, okay, what have other comparable pieces of land sold for recently? Make a series of adjustments, and you get a value, a sort of market value today. However, that value, there is a sort of a pricing mismatch. That value misprices the natural capital benefits that land potentially can offer. And we're increasingly seeing investors who want to drive their capital increasingly towards projects that drive more than just a financial return. They increasingly want a financial return and carbon benefits and biodiversity and social. And those investors with those objectives are willing to pay a higher price for assets that come with those benefits. And as capital increasingly flows to that, towards those sort of assets, that will drive those prices up. So there's this future potential natural capital value, which is the land's intrinsic financial value, the monetizable value from things like carbon credits, and then there's unmonetizable value, which is the sort of the social element and biodiversity element that you may or may not be able to monetize. And we're on this journey between a sort of a pure financial value and a natural capital value. And it's difficult, but there are methodologies that are being worked on related to the capital asset pricing model and use of different discount rates, a reduced discount rate for those investors which have these other objectives, which means that they look at the value of these assets in a completely different way.
And it feels like this is critical to the development of the market, but it's good to hear that those methodologies are developing.
They are developing. I think there are methodologies out there. We're in discussion with one company that has developed a methodology that's been accepted by, adheres to IFRS accounting standards. So there is progress being made. I think it's such a new area that it's going to be a while before it's accepted in the mainstream. And I think what we're looking to do at Foresight Sustainable Forestry is, potentially in the future we would publish two NAVs. We would have the financial value today, but also the natural capital premium or the natural capital value, which tries to quantify all of those additional benefits, both monetizable and non-monetizable.
And thank you for that. Maria, I'm going to ask you to sort of round up for us with some optimistic thoughts.
I was just listening, and I think it's fascinating. It sounds like, carbon markets and offsetting has been, in our lives for a long time. But and we had a discussion earlier about buying land from farmers which has been used for food production for industrial forestry. So I think one thing came to my mind with all of this, because it's new and it's developing, what are the risks? Are there any unintended consequences of developing this huge market and, financial instruments? I think we need to, which is maybe, I'm trying to put it on an optimistic way, which I am. It's about understanding that actually more sustainable living doesn't have to be less enjoyable and less comfortable. I think what it means, it's cleaner air and loveliest nature and abundance of nature that the future generation can enjoy. And I think that's how we need to think about sustainable living. And we, together as customers, consumers, we have huge power. I'm working in retail. We religiously follow. We do what our customers want us to do. So I think, the challenge is big, but I think we must have that optimism to drive that change. But that's only possible if we collectively put all of our efforts and shoulders to the wheel to actually achieve that. But yes, I am optimistic, and this is all really interesting.
Yeah. Thank you. That is an optimistic thought to end on. Thank you. But thank you so much to this panel. Fascinating discussion. I wish we had more time, but thank you so much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much to all of our panel guests there. I think I'm going to spend the coffee break buying some carbon credits. It is now time for our first coffee break of the afternoon. Our coffee sponsor today is KPMG. On your table, you'll find a sustainable and reusable coffee cup. This is a gift for you to take away, as well as to use during the coffee break. So please do enjoy the coffee, and we look forward to picking up with you in about 20 minutes' time.